Hi, and welcome back to Unveiling the Hidden Half. I'm Samantha, and this is the second video of this series. Today's episode corresponds to period 4 of AP US history, spanning from 1800 to 1848. This period saw the rise of democratic ideals, territorial expansion, and intense debates over who could access the rights promised by the Revolution. While the focus is often on the political struggles of the time, it's crucial to explore how women, often overlooked in these discussions, shaped and were shaped by the era. From the first waves of women's rights activism to their crucial roles in abolition and reform, women's voices were central to many of the era's most significant developments. At the turn of the 19th century, women's roles in the young republic were framed by the ideal of Republican motherhood. While this concept emphasized women's roles in raising virtuous, informed citizens, it also expanded opportunities for women's education. If women were to train future voters and statesmen, they themselves needed to be educated. This led to the establishment of institutions like the Troy Female Seminary, founded by Emma Willard in 1821, which aimed to provide women with an education on par with that of men. Republican motherhood was, though, of course, a double-edged sword. On one hand, it celebrated the intellectual capacities of women and opened doors to education. But on the other, it reinforced the idea that women's primary duty was to serve their families. This limited their public roles, ensuring that their political influence remained indirect. But even within the confines of traditional gender roles, women began to challenge societal expectations. Unlike the earlier concept of Republican motherhood, which confined women's influence to raising virtuous citizens, Catherine Beecher expanded this framework by advocating that women should be moral and social leaders not only in the household, but also in schools, churches, and charity organizations. She believed women's nurturing role could extend into the public sphere. This more expansive view of women's influence helped lay the groundwork for increased participation in public life, particularly in social reform movements. One of the most significant ways that women entered public life during this period was through the abolitionist movement. The fight to end slavery was deeply intertwined with women's rights, as women who spoke out against the injustices of slavery often found themselves questioning their own rights. Take, for example, Sojourner Truth, a former enslaved woman who became one of the most powerful voices in the abolitionist and women's rights movement. Born into slavery as Isabella Baumfree, she gained her freedom in 1827 and took the name Sojourner Truth. She declared her intention to travel the country, spreading her message of freedom and equality. In 1851, she delivered her famous Ain't I a Woman speech at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention, powerfully challenging both the racial and gender-based oppression of her time. The Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina, were also instrumental in connecting the struggle for abolition and the struggle for women's rights. Raised in a wealthy slaveholding family in South Carolina, they moved to the North and became outspoken critics of slavery, drawing fire for their public speeches, a bold act for women in the 1830s. Sarah Grimke, in particular, argued that women's subordination mirrored the oppression of enslaved people, laying the groundwork for a more radical vision of women's rights. Female abolitionists built a new foundation for women's activism, recognizing their own fight for equality as inseparable from the broader struggle for human rights. By the 1840s, women's activism had gained momentum, culminating in one of the most famous events in the history of American feminism, the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. It was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and at the convention, Stanton presented the Declaration of Sentiments, a document modeled after the Declaration of Independence, declaring that all men and women are created equal. The Seneca Falls Convention was, by all means, a monumental event. However, it was far from inclusive. No women of color were invited to the convention, excluding Black and Indigenous women from this formative moment in the women's rights movement. Additionally, poor women were not represented, as the attendees were largely white and middle or upper class. This lack of diversity had significant, long-lasting effects on the women's rights movement. The Declaration of Sentiments did not address the struggles of women who were not white, and the convention's rhetoric reflected a racist undercurrent. The focus on securing rights for white women sometimes came at the expense of Black people, especially Black men after the Civil War. When Stanton and others opposed the 15th Amendment, which granted Black men the right to vote, they believed that educated white women should receive the vote before Black men. And I'll elaborate on the effects of this divide more in the next video. The exclusionary nature of the Seneca Falls Convention foreshadowed broader issues in the suffrage movement, where women of color faced obstacles that white feminists often ignored. For example, while white women fought for the right to vote, Native American women were denied citizenship. Similarly, Latina, Black, Asian American, and poor women faced barriers such as literary tests and poll taxes, which persisted legally until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But one important vocab word in understanding the complexity of this is intersectionality. This is the idea that no identities exist in isolation, and that we all have overlapping Venn diagrams of identity factors that make up who we are. But okay, back to the story. Another important person in this time period was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a Black poet, writer, and activist, who would later challenge this exclusion in the years after Seneca Falls. She argued that the women's rights movement needed to confront not only gender inequality, but also racial injustice. For Harper and other women of color, the fight for equality was inseparable from the fight against racism and economic exploitation. One example of this is the profound displacement and erasure of Indigenous peoples, especially women, during the United States' expansion westward under the banner of Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny, the 19th century belief that Americans were divinely destined to expand across the continent, had catastrophic effects on Native American communities, particularly on Indigenous women. As white settlers moved westward, Indigenous populations were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands through violent military campaigns and coercive treaties, like the 1830s Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, which displaced thousands of Choctaw people. For Indigenous women, this era was marked not only by the loss of land, but by the unraveling of the vital roles they played in their communities. Discussed in Video 1, in many Native societies, women held essential roles in decision-making, agriculture, and spiritual life. Among the Cherokee, for example, women like Nanyehi, a beloved woman who had been a key negotiator and community leader, embodied the power women traditionally hold. Cherokee women were responsible for farming and managing land, roles that gave them significant authority within their society. However, as the U.S. government enforced the Indian Removal Act of 1830 under President Andrew Jackson, these roles were stripped away. The forced relocation of tribes such as the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek during the Trail of Tears in the late 1830s resulted in the death of thousands, including many women and children, and shattered Indigenous cultural structures. The devastating consequences of forced removal also made Indigenous women particularly vulnerable to violence. They faced widespread sexual violence from settlers and U.S. soldiers, abuses that were often ignored by the American legal system. The Cherokee women, such as the survivors of the Trail of Tears, reported stories of sexual assault and brutal treatment during the march westward, but justice was rarely pursued. The widespread abuse of Indigenous women was justified by the ideology of Manifest Destiny, which dehumanized native populations and viewed them as obstacles to American progress, rather than sovereign peoples. The early 19th century was a period of promise and of limitation for women in America. While ideas about liberty and democracy expanded, they were still largely confined to white men. Yet even within these constraints, women were carving out spaces for themselves in public life. Through education, reform movements, and the early push for women's rights, they began to challenge the systems that sought to keep them invisible. From the Republican mothers raising the next generation of citizens, to the fierce abolitionists speaking out against slavery, women in this era shaped the future of the United States in ways that are often overlooked. As we move forward into the next chapter of American history, it's important to remember that the fight for equality has always been multifaceted. Driven by women from different backgrounds, with different experiences, but with a shared desire for justice. One last reminder. Remember, no story I ever tell here is complete. I encourage you to use this video as a stepping stone to doing your own research about women in American history. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Unveiling the Hidden Half. Next time, we'll explore the roles of women during the Civil War and Reconstruction as they confronted some of the nation's deepest crises and helped to shape the future of American democracy. I'm Samantha, and I hope to see you then.